Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome again to the fourth session of the semester's Education Policy Colloquium Series, sponsored by the program on Education Policy and Governance. My name is Jim Pizer. I'm an academic visitor here at Kennedy School and former Secretary of Education here in Massachusetts, and it's a pleasure to be working alongside Marty West and Paul Peterson, who made Marty is here today, Paul who may be online, to help organize and sponsor this series. After today, we've got 5 more sessions through April on Thursday at noon, mostly here in Taubman, although there's one that's going to be over at the Graduate School of Education, I think on April 11th. Some of the topics that we'll be discussing over the next several weeks are chronic absenteeism, the effectiveness of preschool, the impact of teacher diversity on student learning, and the state of post-COVID academic recovery across the United States. There's a full listing on the PPG website, so please check it out. And obviously, hopefully you can make as many of those as possible. Our next session is Thursday, March 28th, so next Thursday, when our speaker will be Jesse Broom. He's an assistant professor of education and economics at Brown. And Jesse will be talking about his ongoing research on the potential for using item analysis from state assessments to provide more useful and actionable information on student learning than just looking at scaled scores and overall performance categories. So hopefully you can join us for that session as well. Today's session is also focused on assessment, but primarily through the lens of interim assessments aligned to online instruction programs and materials, namely iReady from Curriculum Associates. Our speaker is Aaron Lotton, who is Vice President with Curriculum Associates, who will be talking about trends in early education achievement, as well as some insights into what the data can tell us about key drivers of academic success, including some early indicators of student learning and readiness before grade 3, which is when students' state assessments take in. And as you all know, one of the challenges with state assessment systems is the fact that they don't provide any data until 3rd grade. And usually the results aren't actually available to educators and parents until students are already in 4th grade. And the data that we do get from the assessments is only a once-a-year dipstick on student performance, which doesn't give us much insight into learning gains throughout the course of the year. Equally important, although there is some degree of alignment between what's being tested and what's being taught on through state assessments, there's a lot of variation from school to school and even classroom to classroom. And of course, each state has its own standards and assessments, so comparisons across state lines are often quite difficult. That's why assessment data from curriculum providers like CA are so important, since they can provide us with before, during, and after snapshots of achievement tied directly to curriculum content, making it possible to more directly track student progress and learning, not only relative to their class or their school peers, but also compared to a very large national sample. Again, something that's very difficult to do through state assessments. And that's why Aaron's presentation today is so valuable. Aaron Lotton has been with Curriculum Associates for close to 10 years, where he's been Vice President for Assessment and Research, Vice President of Marketing, and now Vice President for Customer Experience. He's a graduate of the Air Force Academy and the University of Chicago School of Business. After Aaron's comments, we'll have ample time for questions and answers and discussion, and maybe even take some questions during the presentation itself. We'll certainly give priority to folks who are in the room here in terms of asking and answering questions, but we'll try to incorporate some of the questions and comments from people on Zoom as well. So if you're watching online, please make sure to enter any questions or comments you may have in the chat, and we'll try to get to them before the end of the session. The session is being recorded and will be posted on the website after, hopefully shortly thereafter. So in effect, we'll all be on the record here. So keep that in mind as we go through the conversation. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Aaron Lotton.
Thank you so much, Jim. Hello, everybody. How are you? All right. Let's share and see if we can get this to work. How about that? You guys see my screen? Yep. Perfect. As Jim said, we're going to look at trends in education, trends in achievement data. We're specifically going to dive into some of the things happening with those youngest students, those students in kinder, 1st, and 2nd grade before we start giving them state tests. also have some brand new research that I want to share with you guys that I found really eye-opening about those youngest students. So here's where we are headed. We'll start off with some national trends in reading. We'll look at national trends in mathematics, and that's where we'll look across all of K-8. Then we'll deep dive into some of those Kinder 1 and grade 2 data trends. Some of 1 through 3 here is going to be a little sobering. So we'll end with a little optimism, some things that our research has uncovered that are working. All right, but before I go too deep in, as Jim said, we have an interesting perspective because we're collecting data in almost real time from about 12, 13 million kids across America. We collect that data fall, winter, and spring. School districts, school buildings, individual teachers, state departments of ed, they use that data to say, how are we doing? How are we trending? Where do we need to invest more? Where are we falling behind? Where are we moving ahead? What my team does, I have a weird job. I don't work on the research team that built this content. My team goes out to school districts, state departments of education, and helps them put this data into practice. So the perspective we'll talk from today is a practitioner perspective more than an academic perspective. But I will say almost everything I share here today is actually documented in our research. So we'll pass along 3 or 4 studies published by our assessment and research team. So if you guys want to dive into details, methodology, or get more data, that will all be made available. We'll also share all the slides. So you're going to see a lot of numbers and a lot of charts and a lot of graphs. You'll have all that afterwards if it's helpful for your own work. All right, that's the perspective. We will also toggle a little bit between normative and criterion reference metrics. Normative metrics, looking at populations of students, comparing students to each other, and criterion reference metrics, comparing them to absolute learning standards. I'm primarily going to draw from criterion reference standards today. And the scale that we use will be the iReady scale. So these are just a quick guide to like the colors you're going to see. Dark green, I'm proficient on most of the grade level standards for the grade and the subject that I'm in. Light green, I am placing at grade level, but I haven't mastered all of the content of the grade that I'm in. Yellow, I'm below grade level, but I'm close. And these students in yellow, largely full participants in grade level classroom. And then when we see pink and red, those are students who are more than a year behind. These are placements that we have tied and studied, as Jim mentioned. Every state is doing something slightly differently. We see a lot of variation in what states are doing with their state tests. We've tied this to 30 or 40 state tests and to NAEP. So we have some pretty good ideas that what we're saying here is indicative of what you'll see in your district or in your state. And we've got more technical research that links it if you're interested. So that's kind of the language that we use here today. But I just want to dive in. We'll start talking about some of the national trends of grade. Most of you have already seen this data. The nation's report card data, NAEP scores, 1998. We were at 2017, and our 20-something year progress took us to an average score of 220. And I believe this is 4th grade reading. And then we lost all of that progress in very short order. But you only get this data once every few years. So we collect this same data fall, winter, and spring. And so this is our pattern with a little bit more detail, with a seasonal component, looking at reading grades K through 3. Now it's a lot of numbers, a lot of charts, a lot of data. So I like to look at one slice at a time. The little blue box you'll see here is essentially all the students in a nationally representative sample that are on grade level, that were on grade level in grade 3 in reading in 2019. And at the end of the year, so when we ideally want all of students to have mastered 3rd grade material, we saw 73% of students were at least somewhere at grade level. As you follow that data, this is a trend I'm sure you guys have seen and have heard about. 2021 data looks almost identical to 2022 data. We saw only 64% of students who are at grade level in 2022. And the question that my team is asked by states, by districts, by your local principal is, how are we recovering? What's our progress look like? Where's our momentum? Interestingly, 2023, almost identical to 2022, so almost identical to 2021. This is 3rd grade reading If we look across all grades, K through 3, see super similar patterns. We may or may not have some evidence of a recovery in there, but we're not where we were pre-pandemic anywhere in K through 3 when we look at students' reading scores. If we look at 4 through 8, slightly different story. So if you can imagine, these 4th through 8th grade students, vast majority of them, when pandemic-related interruptions occurred, these students already could read. These students could already access technology. These students had more tools. And if you think about the learning environment of a 4th grader, a 5th grader, a 6th grader in America, more conducive to virtual learning probably than the way that we've historically taught kinder, grade 1, grade 2. So generally you see more continuity when we look at students' ability to get to grade level across grades 4 through 8. Also though, if people are looking for recovery, if they're looking for signs of progress, I'm not a statistician, but that looks awfully flat to me. That looks awfully, that looks like continuity, that looks like more and more of the same. We don't see a lot of evidence, positive trajectory when we look at the whole country. But there is a troubling concern in here. I'll pause here. What if I was a struggling reader before learning interruptions?
Probably even worse.
Probably flatline would be the best that I could hope for. But when we look at students who were below level, we see this growing number. You can see here, moving from 13 to 17 in grade 4, moving from 24 to high 20s in grade 5. There's a growing number of students who are more than a year behind. Those are the students who are going to need the most help to be successful in a grade level classroom, to ultimately be successful in high school, to be college and career ready. So there's a growing number of those students that if we're only looking back at that flat line, we wouldn't see. If we're purely looking at who's passing state tests and who's working at grade level, we won't see the emergence of that group of students who are working below level. How about this year? Have we seen any progress? I'll show you some of the fall data. I've looked at winter data. It's the same. You can crunch numbers and get to second and third decimals. This fall looked a lot like the past couple of falls before it. So on the far left, you have 18 and 19. But if you look at 21, 22, and 23, we generally see a lot of the same when we're looking at this academic year's data. When we talk to school districts, we talk to states about how they're performing as they started, we see continuity. We don't see evidence of rapid recovery. Paul, is there any questions? Please.
Is that last slide just suggesting that kids are getting worse at reading as they progress through our education system?
It's interesting. When I look at skills that they can demonstrate in an assessment, there are fewer students who can demonstrate grade level proficiency now than there were 4 or 5 years ago. That's what I see. Does that mean that they're worse at reading? I mean, if I look at the green in grade 4 there, it looks like an awful lot of the same. It looks like, despite heroic efforts in schools and buildings, largely treading water.
Right, but what I'm saying is, like, if you look at the kindergarten, even if you just compare 2023 to 2023 in 4th grade, kindergarten to 4th grade, like you have more students that are in this sort of 2 or more grade levels below, despite having been in school for presumably 4 or 5 years.
So that's a great question. Not the one I was thinking of, but a good place to pause. What I see there is the standards and the grade level expectations moving faster than the academic progress that happens in schools. So keep in mind, the green is based on a set of expectations for a 4th grader or a 5th grader that moves faster than kids generally move in our school systems. And once I start to fall behind, now I've got to learn a year, 2 years, 3 years worth of reading to catch up. That's a pattern, though, that existed. Even if you look back at the 2018 and 19 data, it's slightly less severe, but that's a pattern that's been there since I've been.
And some of this, though, just the fact that the way the categories are defined, like 2 years below or 3 years below. It's hard to be 3 years below when you're in kindergarten.
So in kindergarten, I can only be a year behind, so the
Right.
categories do change, but the emergence, if you look at the pink and red over time, that does grow and the green does shrink over time, but both things are true. I can be further behind in third grade than I was. So that's K through 4, but look at 5th through 8. More continuity here, like less of a pandemic related drop off, but more of the phenomenon that you saw, just students who are behind and not catching up. That number grows on us as we look at middle school. All right, let's take a look at math. And I'll dive into some of that new work around the youngest students. So when we look here, again, very similar to the reading data, our progress very slow across 20 years. And a little bit of that progress wiped out when we last did national assessment in 2022. The math data are a little bit different than the reading data. So generally, K4, you'll see that same pattern of interruptions to learning, schools doing everything that they can for these kids. We haven't in most grades recovered. We haven't won back the time that we lost with those students during the pandemic. What's most different is actually when I look at middle school. Because unlike reading, where we unlock the ability to read, the changes in what I learned in mathematics, once I become a reader, I get deeper and deeper into reading. In mathematics, there are a lot more lily pads along the way. We see pandemic-related drop-off K through 8 in mathematics. And similar to what we saw in reading, we see at almost every grade, this growing number of students who've fallen behind and who aren't catching up. Math data, how are we doing this year? Have we seen any progress? I've had some people ask me to go down to the 10th and the 100th of a point to see if there's something there. In general, this looks awfully flat to me post-pandemic. Same thing. So what's happening here? This didn't come from our scientists. That's Google, an image clipped off Google here. If the center of the distribution of students was here in 2019, then it's here in 2024. And we know this from our data, but as we share this with states, every state that I'm looking at, I think it's 13 out of 14 now, I've seen the same pattern in their state test data and the percentiles that they report. So if I look, this is data coming from Texas. If you want to do research, Texas gives away a lot of detailed data publicly. It's a super great place to start doing research. It's also a big state and a diverse state with a sophisticated state test. Minimum passing score, so that student who's approaching proficiency in 2019 was in the 18th percentile. Getting to that same level of performance on a state test in 2022 was the 34th percentile. So we had 18% of kids who were below that mark in 2019 and 2022. We have 34%. If I look now at a school at a metric that a school district leader would like to tout at a school board meeting, would like to send to the state, students who are meeting expectations in grade 5 math, that was the 57th percentile in 19. It's the 69th percentile in 2022. In 2023, they did some changes to the test, so the data are a little less complicated. If I look at California, I'm going to see the same story. If I'm looking for students who had nearly met in 2018, that was the 26th percentile. If I look at the same nearly met, that's the 33rd percentile in 22. And when I look now at a score that I would want to achieve at that standard MET score, we see the exact same thing. So again, kids, when I look at those percentiles, kids didn't get smarter. The test didn't get easier. These are the most stable examples that we could find. The student who reaches that standard MET score in 2018, they outranked half of their peers. A student who reached that score in 2022 outranks 61% of their peers. So seeing in each of these state tests is exactly what we saw in NAEP, exactly what we saw in the IRD data. It's a changing of the makeup of the skills that we have in our American schools. I'll pause there. Questions?
It's not a question, it's more of an observation. I think especially if you think, what would you expect if there was a disruption to learning and then we reopened schools, sort of went back to normal? You would see the pattern that you're showing us. If basically we return to the prior rates of progress over time, right? I think people sometimes think if we get kids back in school and resume normal progress, we'll see improvement, but no, you would just see the sort of levels continue to lag behind until you have a new cohort of students moving through. And so I mean, that would be my interpretation of what you're showing.
I have the same interpretation. If you were doing everything you possibly could do in 2019, if everyone was putting every ounce of effort they could in then, and then we interrupted and we set things back, we would expect not dramatic change over time. We'd expect very slow incremental change over time. So I have the same thing.
Until a new cohort of students comes through who education was not disrupted in that same way, then you might expect a recovery if everything again returns to normal. I think what's most new to me and what you've shared and most sobering is I didn't have a clear sense of how the pandemic would have affected kids who were 2, 3, 4 at the time of the disruption, right? Are they going to come in looking like they had been sort of less ready for kindergarten? It seems like that is what you're seeing.
That's exactly where we're
Even though
going
they,
next.
yeah, okay.
Love it. That is the perfect setup.
Before we go on that, how does that sort of connect to or align with the elementary versus middle school data, like on reading in particular, where you had students who, and I'm not sure exactly what the overlap is here, but you may at least have 1 year of data of students who were in elementary school, in your elementary school data set, and then in your middle school data set, and you didn't see worse performance when they got to middle school. Is that because things related to the curriculum or the assessment, or is there something else going on there?
So it's a very interesting question, because if I think about that 6th grader, that is a student who had early elementary education disrupted and is now a middle schooler. And I see remarkable continuity. Maybe you could say a point here and a point there. It's interesting, those students now with time, like there's I think a little bit of reason for optimism there. With time, we're not seeing the drop off in those early elementary interruptions. Now, different story if I'm a little bit worried when I see this 5th grade data here about students who were way behind. But if I look at 6th and 7th grade, we see more continuity and almost like a point or two better off. So those students appear to be resilient. There appears to be, hopefully over time, we'll see some reasons for optimism.
Is it, I mean, they're all relatively flat. There really aren't big changes. I mean, I suppose today's 6th graders obviously had more uninterrupted schooling before the interruption happened than the younger kids.
But if I think about Marty's point of those are students who are performing roughly in line with where they were in 6th grade and who in those early super critical formative 2nd, 3rd grade years had a lot of interruptions. So maybe there's a reason to be optimistic there. We'll know a little bit more at the end of this year and as the years play out. I want to dive into Marty's question and take a look at some of the data from youngest learners. So I'll pause there. Where do you learn before you're in kindergarten? At home? The number one answer, top of the board, absolutely. Where else?
Preschool.
Preschool? Daycares? A lot of the questions, I've asked this question of big American school districts, and my neighbor's basement is a very popular answer. The school community ed, some sort of state-funded formal preschool. The thing I hear an awful lot of is grandma. What do these three things have in common?
We're also just.
Also disrupted, and that is why some of this news. Yeah, and my neighbor may not have been taking kids during that pandemic. That may not have sounded safe or smart to anyone, including her. My community ed program, my state-funded preschool and pre-K programs, almost most of those were disrupted, interrupted, closed down, or started altogether. And even grandma, in some cases, was closed for business in a lot of scenarios. So when we look, this is simply an average, the average score of students entering into K1 and 2 in 21, 22, and 23. And to the point that we talked about earlier, if it's disrupted, I would expect continuity when I get you back, but I would also expect over time, if we're doing everything we can in first, second, and third grade, we don't have reason unless we're doing something wildly different that these numbers would accelerate. When I look at the math data, you see here, the top bar is kindergarten. In 2022, those students were slightly lower performing, and again in 23. If I look at first grade and second grade, slightly worse in each of those scenarios. We look at that same red, yellow, green convention that we looked at before. Every grade, every year, we see a little bit less green, a little bit more red when we look at those students' performance coming into our schools. Is even their learning was disrupted. This is data from fall of this year. So this is before we get to do our work as an education system. This is how students are walking through the door in those earliest grades. It looks to me like teaching kinder first and second has gotten harder. This is the same data for reading. And again, you see generally the same trend that we are below 2019 conventions, but after 45 slides of fairly dismal data, I present to you one happy thought. Take a look at second graders in reading. Now, if I think about a second grader in 2023 in reading, that's the student who was potentially most disrupted during the pandemic. But once we've had them in our buildings, once our teachers have been able to do their work, that's where we are seeing some progress. That second grade reading scores, those are moving up over time. At least we're moving in the right direction.
But just so those were students who were in kindergarten in 2021.
Yes.
So, yeah. You have to say the happy story for better saying. Yeah, okay.
No.
But that's to your point, they missed whatever they would have gotten before, where that was disrupted. But their K to 12 experience, or at least their first 3 years, were not actually. I mean, 2021 was.
2021 was a messy year.
Yeah. Anyway,
So are these fall or spring scores?
These are all fall sports.
Okay, and what's your explanation for the delayed decline for kindergarten?
I
don't
don't,
need
like,
to have
I don't have like that. I'm thinking back to what have educators' reactions been? I don't have a strong hypothesis. Maybe I walked in the door with, if I was a 2021 kindergartner, maybe I got enough letters, numbers, sounds, grammar, books, how to line up, how to go to the bathroom. Maybe I got enough of that I had a strong start. But then the people who followed me in kinder in 22 and 23, that's a guess, and that's been reinforced by a few school districts who've seen this same. So, but no, don't see the same happy story, no Care Bear for math. If I look at the same data here again for reading in the same red, yellow, green convention, I do see in second grade some reason for optimism there, with each year in second grade seeing in the fall as students enter into our system slightly less red, slightly more green, not quite to where we were in 2019, but we're going in the right direction. I'll pause there. Any questions? So we've already talked a little bit about this. How's the learning environment different for these students during the pandemic? I'd also say that once these students got back from the pandemic, interruptions, intermittent closures, class level and building level quarantines. A lot of teachers have said, we had masks, and so teaching vowel sounds, getting a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old to pay attention to me without seeing my mouth move for 4 or 5 hours a day, that sounds hard to me. Like, I've jumped out of airplanes. I've played rugby on 3 continents. Her job right there is the scariest thing in the world to me. I do not know how people do that. During the pandemic, we know that their learning was disrupted. Shortly after, the tools at your disposal, can you use manipulatives and have students share them without sanitizing those every 20 minutes in between? The environment these students had when they got back was also different. So how is it different to teach kinder and grade 1 now?
More need to start with the basics.
I think that's the number one thing. Like, do I know things like letters and numbers walking in the door anymore? What else? Please.
More behavioral and social issues.
It's actually the number one thing that when I talk to kinder and grade 1 teachers, they say that to me. They're like, how to play nice, how to sit in a group, how to sit still, how to line up and go to the bathroom are skills I now need to make room for in my day. All of those things I think are harder, but the toughest question on here, how have we reacted to the changing nature of kinder and grade 1?
Probably pretty much the same.
That is the reaction of most schools. Now, I would say some have seen and recognized, especially that social and emotional learning and that need for more basics that we talked about. So they're making room in the time, they're trying to make room, they're trying to give tools to people. Most people, what I've given to a grade K and a grade 1 teacher in terms of tools, time, super similar to what we were doing 5 years ago. In a few places though, even if I give them tools, if I give them training in more basics, in more of what we might call preschool skills or social and emotional skills, behavioral skills, that time needs to come from somewhere. If you think back to all those grade 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 friends, like we need more time for math and reading too. So this to me is one of the biggest predicaments facing schools right now. I'd also say, Jim mentioned, research into chronic absenteeism is another phenomenon that shapes this data. If students are less likely to be in the room, and if you layer on top of that teacher shortages that affect hundreds of American school systems. So now I'm trying to buck those trends that we looked earlier. Students walk in with fewer skills, they're in the building fewer days, and I have less veteran teachers. Please.
The number of kids that fall from 19 to 22, assuming the same number of schools that you're tracking, but probably added some schools. Have those numbers changed?
So we have dramatically more students in 2023 than we had in 2019. But our research team samples from those. The data you've looked at here aren't all of our iReady data because that would massively skew towards New York, Chicago, Miami, Los Angeles. These data draw from a representative sample of America. Please.
I'm curious, you mentioned your team homeschools educators at learning from iReady, and I'm curious if you feel like these standards obviously helpful for comparisons, but given where we are, and I think like in large urban districts, the role of trauma and things like that, do you feel like these standards, these grade level standards are productive and helpful for teachers to see student progress and to make adjustments, or do you feel like maybe they're outdated? Or not, just not.
I think that's
appropriate anymore?
That's an excellent question. In those conversations, I generally say, like, we don't want to, these students are every bit as capable. They have had interruptions. They are just as capable as the kids who had 5 years. So I'm reluctant to move the bar back. And I also know that when I look at state tests, they're not moving the bar back. So I have to help you find success on that state test. I also have to help you achieve your academic potential, which all our hypotheses are that those are unchanged. But I will say Once we get out of the district and into the building and the classroom level, we go give people a much more granular level of data. We take them down to specific domains, specific skills. Can you blend phonemes? Can you segment words into syllables? Do you understand how a decimal point works? Like, we take people to a much more granular level because that's where the actual action has to happen in the classroom. So this state departments and district leaders is what we share in a classroom level. We got to get much closer. It doesn't make sense to show a national data trend to a teacher, show them where her kids are at and what skills they need. Does that kind of sort of answer?
Yeah, it does. I guess I'm also wondering, like we were talking about social emotional learning for junior and grade 1. I guess I personally, and I worked in a Montessori school, so I'm particularly interested in blending standards, but I wonder if having more time for that social emotional learning early on, that means you can focus more on the academics later on and end up in the same place by grade 4 or by grade 8.
That's certainly not my area of expertise or where I've done research, but it's the people who've taught those kids will go all agree. But that is a necessary, like, paying attention, playing nice, being focused, that I can't add and subtract 2-digit numbers until I've covered that. And when we talk and hear about the stories of people who have bucked this trend, because this trend isn't everywhere, that is a very common ribbon of life. We focused on the whole kid. We worried about all the other things going on. All of this research in 100 times more detail, we'll give a link to you guys to anyone who's interested who wants to dive deeper into this. I don't know why there's a picture of my dog and some chicken on here, but that's what I went with for what is working. My dog is technically a sporting breed, but has done no work and no sport. What is working? I'm going to share one piece of research that I'm super excited about here. Some colleagues, and I did this pre-pandemic, but we've replicated this on local levels, on state levels, and district levels hundreds of times since then. This is the one trick that always works. So we looked at 425,000 students nationwide, and we tried to understand the parallels between the skills they had in kinder, first, and second grade, and their ultimate success in grades 2, 3, and 4. There's tons of research out there that's super rigorous, has been vetted, replicated, that if I'm a great reader and a good little mathematician in 3rd, 4th grade, I'm set up for success academically. I can build on that foundation. So we said, how do you get to that foundation of being a good little reader in 3rd grade? What we found is that being a good reader in K1, that is predictive of being a good reader in 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade. But there is unique power to certain skills. So there's dozens of research questions covered in this work, but most of it boils down to, if I've got phonics in grade 1, what does that mean for me as a grade 3? What we found, because using that same red, yellow, green scale, we can align students with where they're at academically, specifically just on phonics. And here I'm looking at phonics in winter of grade 1. This using 16, 17, and 18, 19 data. And I picked winter of grade 1 because talking to educators, they're like, after I've had you for a year and a half, I should have some, I have been able to do a little bit of my K1 work. I have spent a little bit of time with you and I should have been able to build some skills. So it is less a function of what you walked in the door with. You're now kind of a product of our school system. So if I think about those skills specifically in phonics in grade 1, and then I play the tape forward to grade 3, we find that phonics isn't destiny, but it's almost destiny. If I look specifically just at students who reach mid on grade level, so that means I've got most of the phonics skills you could expect a student to have in 1st grade. 94% of those students placed on grade level in grade 3, which is a number that almost any large school system in America would kill for. If I look even at students who are early on level, so students who are just beginning to grasp 1st grade phonics, by winter of grade 1, I now see 83% of those students are grade level readers in grade 3. As soon as I'm a year behind in winter of grade 1, I start to see a crazy mixed bag. Some of those students take off, some of those students struggle, but I see the patterns all over the place there. And if I'm 2 years behind, so if I'm still, that'd be like pre-K phonics skills in grade 1, 75% of those students struggling readers in 3rd grade. So this information was helpful to me because this gives me something to focus on. It gives me something to prioritize. It gives me something to say, you know, at all costs, we get this one right. Phonics aren't the only foundational skill. It's not the only skill that we covered this. So we asked, what about phonological awareness? What about high frequency words and the other skills that we would consider foundational skills that we assess in iReady? You see not quite the same power as phonics. You see a super similar pattern across grades 1st to 3rd in phonological awareness. Very similarly, high frequency words, not the same power as phonics, but the same pattern here. This is work. These are patterns that we have probably replicated in 50 or 100 school districts over the last 2 years, and the numbers change, but the pattern has never changed. This is going to get a little goofy and wonky. Apologies in advance. That is only helpful if, like, being a good reader in kindergarten means I'm a good reader in 3rd grade. That just shifts the problem from one year to another. This is this is models that came out of regression analysis that we did, where we essentially modeled students who were, and here I'm early on grade levels, I'm that light green in every one of the skills that we assess in kinder 1st, 2nd grade. The blue and green bars are essentially us running through a model and saying, if you were missing first one skill in the first 6 bars and in the last 2 bars, combinations of skills, if you're missing something, how far behind would you potentially be? So the orange bar, ideally, every kid in America would be early on grade in those skills in grade 1. If I look, though, at what happens if I'm missing a skill, at what a model would tell me, I would say the gaps in some of the higher order, like comprehension and vocabulary skills, much smaller than if I'm missing those foundational skills. And if I look at combinations of skills, I'm not sure that this student actually exists. But if I had all the comp and lit and vocabulary and struggling in the foundations, I would have one type of gap. But if I model what it is like to be missing the foundations, an incredible gap. So what this tells us is not all of these skills are necessarily equal. That gives us some sort of room to prioritize, to shift time, to give emphasis to those K1 and 2 teachers who've got the toughest job on the
Just to push a little bit, one thing that could be going on here, though this sounds very plausible to me, is that you're better at measuring phonics as a discrete skill than you are comprehension of an informational text. Because we know, like, when you're measuring comprehension of informational text, there are all these things that get in the way, like differences in students' background knowledge. They happen to know about a particular subject that's there. And so if you're just really much better at measuring phonics, because it's very well defined and you can sort of assess it, that I think would produce the same type of pattern, even if they were all equally valued.
Got it. That's an awfully good question. I actually want to run that by Chris and Lori the next time I get to hang out with them a little bit. Interestingly, when I did the same thing in mathematics, it didn't work. And in mathematics, we have the same problem. We're better at measuring some skills than other skills, but we didn't see the clarity. We explained less in the model, and we just saw less variation in predictive power of the different factors. I'd be interested to send you the paper and see what you think.
Actually, one other question which you may not have looked at is, did you track any of these students beyond 3rd grade? So in other words, was it a, sort of thing where it works itself out eventually, right? And then the students are sort of more equal than not.
I've done it at district level, and it's almost the opposite. There's very little disruption after third, fourth, fifth grade. After third, fourth, fifth grade. And then certainly not to say that there isn't any, not to say that some don't accelerate and some don't fall behind, but third, fourth, and fifth are wildly predicted success.
Maybe the other question, which is more maybe a hypothesis about practice, is the extent to which a phonics focus early, as in like for first grade focus, is something that goes away as students get older. So in other words, it could be that teachers are spending more time on phonics in first grade, but the students that don't get it in first grade, they've now missed their opportunity because they're not getting as much of it in second and third grade, and therefore they don't catch, even though they could have caught up, they don't.
I don't have a specific piece of research, but every pattern I've looked at compares that idea out. So again, full research is available. So I'll pass along to you guys. We call it the state of student learning, which is essentially the trends across all of math and reading. It gets into both, all grades K through 8, math and reading, and does some investigation of domains. I'll send you guys that work. I'll send you guys the K2 readiness research that looks like fall of Kinder 1 and 2, and I'll send you this research so that you have them all. That's what I had for you. What more questions do you guys have? What did we leave out?
That's what they're at.
Please.
I have questions regarding the cognitional skills in grade 1 and the outcomes in grade 3. So do you control for any other variables, such as like income, parents' income, or the school themselves? Because that might just be the fact that they were good in first grade because they had a good schools, maybe their parents also invested more in their education, and hence obviously grade 3 they would actually be better outcomes for that.
I don't recall the controls in the particular study. I can tell you that I replicated it in Baltimore, New York City, like Miami, Dallas, like large urban school districts with a ton of populations that are struggling. And that phenomenon, while the numbers move, the phenomenon in the overall relationship is held true in 50 different localities where you have wildly different economics and demographics.
Options proposals that are being implemented to increase the learning achievements in order to get indicators post-COVID as higher COVID.
I wish I could say there's like a consensus out there. I've seen people do 100 different things. Say in large urban school districts, one thing that they are saying that they expect to be successful with is larger math and reading blocks. How do I make up for lost time? It's with more time. Now, those things aren't free. They come at a cost. Like the number of hours that a school can have a student sitting in a classroom or interacting with a teacher in, those are largely fixed in America. We saw some really cool experimentation with people's ESSER dollars of doing things outside of a school day. Because they said, hey, the thing I need is exposure. The thing I need is contact time. The thing I need. If these kids are just as capable, they lost time, I need to give them time back. So we saw some cool experiments with people extending school days and extending school weeks right after the pandemic. Right now, as people get hemmed in more to the traditional school day, see people moving to larger math and reading blocks. We are also seeing, as science of reading takes off, we are seeing more emphasis just about everywhere we go on those foundational skills. Like that is the move away from whole language and towards science of reading is something that I think is catching on in most of the schools I work with.
Maybe in some ways kind of picking up on that a little bit. Your data set is among iReady users, right?
Yes.
Which in some ways suggests that the broader data set, if you were assessing all students, whether they're iReady users or not, might look even worse because the extent to which iReady is embodying or embedding some of those sort of pedagogical and curricular approaches that others may not be using. And we talked a little bit earlier about the alignment between your data and state assessment data, but do you think that that's, potentially or likely to hold true, that actually what we're looking at is not necessarily the best case scenario, but actually a more positive picture than if we were looking at the universe of students?
When I look at any individual district or state that is a major concern for us, we try to do as much sampling as we can to correct for as much of that as we can. And we also benchmark, like I said, like the Texas and the California data. Texas and California told slightly different stories than each other, slightly different stories from what I already said. But in Texas, that is a giant state with a diverse population, and I-READY is a very small part of it. We're a much bigger part of California, but we saw generally those same patterns. So I am certain that we are off if we're just looking at I-READY users in some way, shape, or form. I'm certain we're off by a little bit, but I don't think we're off by a lot, is what I've seen in states where we have time.
But so that says that the numbers we're looking at here are probably a pretty good reflection of what we're going to see on the spring data, the spring assessments that are done by states. But some of this may be better, show a more positive result than the overall numbers, because they're using a high quality curriculum that, is well aligned to their assessment and is incorporating some of the core skills I'm talking about.
It's entirely possible. It's entirely possible.
Are there systems in the I-READY data set that have shown significant recovery? So you focused on the central tendency here. Tom Kane, tracking outcomes through last spring state test, has found a little bit of variation in the amount of, or the rate of recovery. And recovery, to go back to where we started, would need to be driven by like greater than typical progress.
Absolutely.
So are there systems that you can point to where you see greater than typical progress in your data?
Absolutely. So one of the most common, and again, I've seen 100 different flavors of success, like how people buck this trend is widely varied. We haven't, targeted student-specific instruction in our program where we figure out the skill you were missing, and we deliver that skill to you in individual learning time. Because if you think about it, no two students, no two buildings have the exact same pandemic experience. So targeting specific skills that they missed, specific concepts that they didn't master, we have seen tremendous benefit to that. We have also seen, now is the time for different goal setting. I wouldn't give any student a goal based on central tendencies, mathematical averages for their growth. I would give them a goal based on proficiency. There's tons of research that shows that goal setting matters for student performance. And we have seen that in individual buildings and districts that changed goal setting, but that also mattered. So targeted skill intervention, goal setting, and then a couple of researchers on our team wrote an interesting paper. It doesn't get a ton of love from some of the districts that I share it with, but it talks about like the practices of places where they saw tremendous growth and recovery. And I'd say the reaction is kind of the same reaction of like a doctor who said he was going to write a 2-page book when he finished. And he says, get 30 minutes of exercise every day and get most of your calories from vegetables. Like the practices underlying what great growth looked like, of understand the whole student, have a culture of data, make time for grade level instruction and intervention. Like there's a lot of very tried and true practices of people who have remarkable adherence to those and a lot of focus on those. We have seen greater growth. We have seen a lot of stories and a lot of patterns of them bucking this trend. So this is, as you said, it's the central tendency. There are definitely outliers who have won back that lost time and growing.
But is there a pattern that suggests that like lower income districts or higher poverty districts and schools are performing worse, or put it differently, have not seen the same recovery trajectory as higher income?
Yeah, that's
districts and schools?
And that's actually covered in pretty good detail in the state of student learning if anyone wants to get into it. So we did see the impact of the pandemic was much greater in low income schools. So when we mapped our data to NCES data and looked at income, their drop off was more severe. recovery to normal has been faster in high income districts. That's because they have just less ground to cover. Like their dip was very small. So a modest increase gets you back to that. We've seen some urban school districts, high poverty school districts that have had actually tremendous growth since then. They also had huge gaps to recover. So we saw bigger gaps and in some cases bigger recovery just because there's more space, there's more opportunity for improvement in some of those spots. But we definitely did not see equal losses from the pandemic. Like the pandemic hit our urban and our high poverty schools the hardest.
So it may be, and not to put words in your mouth or sort of aggregate things inappropriately, but it may be that higher income schools or students have a smaller drop, lower income students in schools that have had generally a bigger drop, and they're improving at the same level, the same rate, which means that the gap, which grew during the pandemic, remains at a larger level than it was pre-pandemic.
That is, you said it better than I. That's exactly what we see. If you look at the state of student learning research that we share, you'll see exactly that pattern. Please.
Are there any particular barriers you would point to when thinking about, you mentioned the targeting specific skills that specific learners behind on? Are there barriers, I guess, on the curriculum associate side or on the teacher school leader side to implementing that kind of solution? Or do you feel like that's widely in use?
No, I would say there are definitely barriers. The biggest one that I have heard is time. The thing that every district will tell you is like, these are cool ideas, these are great practices. My staff are screaming at me that there's no possible way to do the 19 things you've asked me to do with my school week. You just asked me to do 3 more and didn't take any away. Like the number one barrier that we face is time.
Do we have any online comments or questions? Okay. Anyone else? Looked like you were about to say something.
Fantastic.
Very good.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.